Hello and welcome back to The Gentleman Psychic. As usual, because I'm not using Restream, um, I'm not paid to say that, but I know on my other show I do use Restream. So I have to go on here and send these messages to all of my other public. So I have to go onto YouTube here, and we'll see that I'm live. And let's see. Okay, I am live, and I'm going to copy that one, share that, copy link, move over here to this one. We'll post it here. Go over here. Let's see. I just have a couple of places to send it. Hi, Lauren. Good to see you. Let's see. We'll go to the news feed. We'll post it there. I hear that Restream is better now. And again, Restream works when I'm doing the scared and alone thing. But we will do that. And I have to go over here to okay, there we go, and publish that one. I didn't put a comment on it. Hi, Mary Jane. Hi, Casey girl. Hi, Matthew. Good to see you. I missed you earlier in class, but it is good to see you. I'm just going to readjust my lighting. I feel like I did not do a good job of my preset up, and you get to see behind the scenes because, again, it is only me, but that looks not so pretty. Is that better? I think that might be better. Okay. I think maybe it would be better a little bit more. Oh, there we go. Now you can see me. Now I don't look dead. All right. So I want to thank every one of you for coming. Hi, Cody. There's the clock. Winky Whispers, new to your channel, been watching some of your videos. Well, welcome. I need to get back to actual recordings, but lately I've been doing a lot of story time, which is good for me. It helps me to read books, and it is also, I hope you find it entertaining. Matthew, you have been managing around certain classes this month. Yes, that makes sense. Thank you, Cody, for that. That is very lovely of you. So I am your host, Richard Lale Lillard. Richard Lale is one name. Richard Lale is not two names. If I were just Richard, I'd be a dick. Anyway, that is one of my jokes that I do like to reiterate. Hello, everybody. It is so lovely to have you here. I am so excited to get back into H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. I do want to direct you a little bit over to my Instagram. If you are interested in some art, I have several pieces that I have painted that are for sale, that are available. You just have to kind of go to Instagram and you'll be able to see what it is that I have to offer. So also, if you would like some individual art that is not listed, if there is something that you would like me to commission, I also do that. All right, lovelies. Well, I suppose it is time we get back into H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Now, we left off when the pods have just crashed. Our hero managed to just make it back to town, and yes, so very exciting. Anyway, let's crack it open and see what happens with our War of the Worlds. Oh, speaking of which, I'm using this Queen of Hearts as a bookmark, and funny thing about this one is that it is World Airways. War of the Worlds. Very interesting. Funny thought. Okay. We left off on chapter 7. So the heat rays at Chobham Road have just been through, but now we're going to go over to chapter 7, How I Reached Home. For my own part, I remember nothing of my flight except the stress of blundering against trees and stumbling through the heather. All about me gathered the invisible terrors of the Martians. That pitiless sword of heat seemed whirling to and fro, flourishing overhead before it descended and smote out life. I came into the road between the crossroads and Horsell, and ran along this to the crossroads. At last, I could go no further. I was exhausted with the violence of my emotion and of my flight, and I staggered and fell by the wayside. That was near the bridge that crosses the canal by the gasworks. I fell and lay still. I must have remained there some time. I sat up, strangely perplexed for a moment, perhaps. I could not clearly understand how I came there. My terror had fallen from me like a garment. My hat had gone, and my collar had burst away from its fastener. A few minutes before, there had only been three real things before me: the immensity of that night and space and nature, my own feebleness and anguish, and the near approach of death. Now it was as if something turned over and the point of view altered abruptly. There was no sensible transition from one state of mind to the other. I was immediately the self of transition from one state. Oh, I was immediately the self of every day again, a decent, ordinary citizen. The silent common, the impulse of my flight, the starting flames were as if they had been in a dream. I asked myself, had these latter things indeed happened? I could not credit it. I rose and walked unsteadily up the steep incline of the bridge. My mind was blank wonder. My muscles and nerves seemed drained of their strength. I dare say I staggered drunkenly. A head rose over the arch, and the figure of a workman carrying a basket appeared. Beside him ran a little boy. He passed me, wishing me good night. I was minded to speak to him, but did not. I answered his greeting with meaningless mumble and went on over the bridge. Over the Mulberry Arch a train, billowing tumult of white, firelit smoke, and a long caterpillar of lighted windows went flying south, clatter, clatter, clap, rap, and it had gone. A dim group of people talked in the gate of one of the houses of the pretty little row of gables that was called Oriental Terrace. It was all so real and so familiar, and that behind me it was frantic, fantastic. Such things, I told myself, could not be. Perhaps I am a man of exceptional moods. I do not know how far my experience is common. At times I suffer from the strangest sense of detachment from myself and the world about me. I seem to watch it all from the outside, and somewhere inconceivably remote, out of the time, out of space, stress of tragedy of it all. This feeling was very strong upon me that night. Here was another side to my dream. But the trouble was blank incongruity of this serenity and the swift death flying yonder. Not 2 miles away, there was a noise of business from the gasworks, and the electric lamps were alight. I stopped the group of people. "What news from the common?" said I. There were 2 men and a woman at the gate. "Eh?" said one of the men, turning. "What news from the common?" I said. "Ain't you just been there?" asked the men. "People seem fairly silly about the common," said the woman over the gate. "All apart." "Haven't you heard of the men from Mars?" said I. "The creatures from Mars." "Quite enough," said the woman over the gate. "Thinks," and all three of them laughed. I felt foolish and angry. I tried to found I could not tell them what I had seen. They laughed again at my broken sentences. "You'll hear more yet," I said, and went on to my home. I startled my wife at the doorway, so haggard was I. I went into the dining room, sat down, drank some wine, and so soon as I could collect myself sufficiently, I told her the things I had seen. The dinner, which was a cold one, had already been served and remained neglected on the table while I told my story. There is one thing, I said, to allay the fears that I had aroused. They are the most sluggish things I ever saw crawl. They may keep the pit and kill people who come near them, but they cannot get out of it. But the horror of them. Don't, dear, said my wife, knitting her brows and putting her hand on mine. Poor Ogilvy, I said. To think he may be lying dead there. My wife, at least, did not find my experience incredible. When I saw how deadly white her face was, I ceased abruptly. They may come here, she said again and again. I pressed her to take wine and try to reassure her. They can scarcely move, I said. I began to comfort her and myself by repeating all that Ogilvy had told of me, the impossibility of the Martians establishing themselves on Earth. In particular, I laid stress on the gravitational difficulty. On the surface of Earth, the force of gravity is 3 times what is on the surface of Mars. A Martian, therefore, would weigh 3 times more than on Mars, albeit his muscular strength would be the same. His body would be a cope of lead to him. That, indeed, was the general opinion. Both the Times and the Daily Telegraph, for instance, insisted on it the next morning, and both overlooked, just as I did, 2 obvious modifying influences. The atmosphere of Earth, we know now, contains far more oxygen or far less argon, whichever way one likes to put it, than does Mars. The invigorating influences of this excess of oxygen upon the Martians indisputably did much to counterbalance the increased weight of their bodies, and, in the second place, we all overlooked the fact that such mechanical intelligence as the Martian possessed was quite able to dispense with muscular exertion at a pinch. But I did not consider these points at the time, and so my reasoning was dead against the chances of the invaders. With wine and food, the confidence of my own table, and the necessity of reassuring my wife, I grew, by insensible degrees, courageous and secure. They have done foolish things, said I, fingering my wine-glass. They are dangerous because no doubt they are mad with terror. Perhaps they expected to find no living things, certainly no intelligent living things. A shell in the pit, said I. If the worst comes to the worst, we'll kill them all. The intense excitement of the events had no doubt left my perceptive powers in a state of earthism. I remember that dinner table with extraordinary vividness even now. My dear wife's sweet, anxious face peering at me from under the pink lampshade, the white cloth of its silver and glass table furniture, for in those days even philosophical writers had many little luxuries. The crimson purple wine in my glass are photographically distinct. At the end of it, I sat tempering nuts with a cigarette, regretting Ogilvy's rashness and denouncing the short-sighted timidity of the Martians. So some respectable dodo in the Martians might have lorded it in his nest and discussed the arrival of that shipful of pitiless sailors in want of animal food. We will peck them to death tomorrow, my dear. I did not know it, but that was the last civilized dinner I was to eat for very many strange and terrible days. Chapter 8. Friday night. The most extraordinary thing to my mind, of all the strange and wonderful things that happened upon that Friday, was the dovetailing of the commonplace habits of our social order with the first beginnings of the series of events that was to topple that social order headlong. If on Friday night you had taken a pair of compasses and drawn a circle with a radius of 5 miles round Woking sandpits, I doubt if you would have had one human being outside it, unless it were some relation of Stent or 3 or 4 cyclists of London people lying dead on the common. whose emotions or habits were at all affected by the newcomers. Many people had heard of the cylinder, of course, and talked about it in their leisure, but it certainly did not make the sensation that an ultimatum to Germany would have done. In London that night, poor Henderson's telegram describing the gradual unscrewing of the shot was judged to be canard, and his evening paper, after writing authentication from him and receiving no reply, the man was killed, decided not to print a special edition. Even within 5 Mile Circle, the great majority of people were inert. I have already described the behavior of men and women to whom I spoke. All over the district, people were dining and supping. Working men were gardening after the labors of the day. Children were being put to bed. Young people were wandering through the lanes, love-making, students over their books. Maybe there was a murmur in the village streets, a novel and dominant topic in the public houses, and here and there a messenger, or even an eyewitness of the later occurrences, caused a whirl of excitement, a shouting and running to and fro. But for the most part of the daily routine of working, eating, drinking, sleeping went on as it had done for countless years, as though no planet Mars existed in the sky. Even at Woking Station and Horsell and Chobham, that was the case. In Woking Junction, until a late hour, trains were stopping and going on. Others were shunting on the sidings, passengers were alighting and waiting, and everything was proceeding in the most ordinary way. A boy from the town, trenching on Smith's Monopoly, was selling papers with the afternoon's news. The ringing impact of trucks, the sharp whistle of the engines from the junction, mingled with the shouts of men from Mars. Excited men came into the station about 9 o'clock with incredible tidings and caused no more disturbance than drunkards might have done. People rattling London words peered into the darkness outside the carriage windows and only saw a rare, flickering, vanishing spark dance up from the direction of Horsell, a red glow and a thin veil of smoke driving across the stars, and thought that nothing more serious than a hearth fire was happening. It was only round the edge of the common that any disturbance was perceptible. There were half a dozen villas burning on the Woking border. There were lights in all the houses on the common side and 3 villages, and the people were kept awake till dawn. A curious crowd lingered restlessly, people coming and going, but the crowd remaining, both on the Chobham and Horsell bridges. 1 or 2 adventurous souls, it was afterwards found, went into the darkness and crawled quite near the Martians, but they never returned. For now and again, a light ray, like the beam of warship searchlight, swept the common, and the heat ray was ready to follow. Save for such, that big area of common was silent and desolate, and the charred bodies lay about on it all night under the stars, and all the next day. A noise of hammering from the pit was heard by many people. So you have the state of things on Friday night, in the center striking into the skin of our old planet Earth, like a poison dart, was this cylinder. But the poison was scarcely working yet. Around it was a patch of silent common, smoldering in places, and with a few dark, dimly seen objects lying in the contoured attitudes here and there. Here and there was a burning bush or a tree. Beyond was a fringe of excitement, and further than that fringe, the inflammation had not crept as yet. In the rest of the world, the stream of life still flowed, and it had flowed for immemorial years. The fever of war that would presently clog vein and artery, deaden nerve, and destroy brain had still to develop. All night long, the Martians were hammering and stirring, sleepless, indefatigable. You couldn't make them tired. At work, upon the machines, they were making ready, and ever and again a puff of greenish-white smoke whirled up to the starlit sky. About 11, a company of soldiers came through Horsell and deployed along the edge of the common to form cordon. Later, a second company marched through Chobham to deploy on the north side of the common. Several officers from the Inkerman barracks had been on the common earlier in the day, and one, Major Eden, was reported to be missing. The colonel of the regiment came to the Chobham Bridge and was busy questioning the crowd at midnight. The military authorities were certainly alive to the seriousness of the business. About 11, the next morning's papers were able to say a squadron of hussars, 2 Maxims, and about 400 men of the Carignan regime started from Aldershot. A few seconds after midnight, the crowd in Chestersea Road, Woking, saw a star fall from heaven into pine woods to the northwest. It had a greenish color and caused a silent brightness like summer lighting. This was the second cylinder. Chapter 9. The fighting begins. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude, too, hot and close, with, I am told, rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept but little. Though my wife had succeeded in sleeping and I rose early, I went into my garden before breakfast and stood listening. But towards the common there was nothing stirring but a lark. The milkman came as usual. I heard the rattle of his chariot, and I went round the side gate to ask the latest news. He told me that during the night the Martians had been surrounded by troops, and that the guns were expected. Then, a familiar reassuring note, I heard a train running towards Woking. They aren't to be killed, said the milkman, if that can possibly be avoided. I saw my neighbor gardening, chatted with him for a time, and then strolled in to breakfast. It was a most unexceptional morning. My neighbor was of the opinion that the troops would be able to capture or to destroy the Martians during the day. It's a pity they make themselves so unapproachable, he said. It would be curious to know how they live on another planet. We might learn a thing or two. He came up to the fence and extended a handful of strawberries, for his gardening was as generous as it was enthusiastic. At the same time, he told me of the burning of the pine woods about Byfleet golf links. They say, said he, that there's another of those blessed things fallen there, number 2, but one's enough, surely. This lot'll cost the insurance people a pretty penny before everything's settled. He laughed with an air of the greatest good humor as he said this. The woods, he said, were still burning and pointed out a haze of smoke to me. They will be hot underfoot for a few days on account of the thick soil of pine needles and turf, he said, and then grew serious over poor Ogilvy. After breakfast, instead of working, I decided to walk down towards the common. Under the railway bridge, I found a group of soldiers, sappers, I think, men in small round caps, dirty red jackets, unbuttoned and showing their blue shirts, dark trousers and boots, coming to the calf. They told me no one was allowed over the canal, and looking along the road towards the bridge, I saw one of the Cardigan men standing sentinel there. I talked with these soldiers for a time. I told them my sight of the Martians on the previous evening. None of them had seen the Martians, and they had but the vaguest ideas of them. So that they plied me with questions. They said their idea was that a dispute had arisen at the Horse Guards. The ordinary sapper is a great deal better educated than the common soldier, and they discussed the peculiar conditions of the possible fight with some acuteness. I described the heat ray to them, and they began to argue among themselves. Crawl up under cover and rush 'em, say I, said one. Get out, said another. What's cover against this here? Sticks to cook your... what we got to do is go near as the ground will let us, and then drive a trench. Blow ye trenches. You always want trenches. You ought to have been born with a rabbit, Snippy. Ain't they got any necks, then? Said a third abruptly, a little contemplative dark man smoking a pipe. I repeated with my description. Octopuses, said he. That's what I calls 'em. Talk about the fishers of men, fighters of fish that is this time. It ain't no murder-killing beast like that, said the first speaker. Why not shell the darned things, straight off and finish 'em, said the little dark man. You can't tell what they might do. Where's your shells, said the first speaker. There ain't no time. Do it and rush. That's my tip, and do it at once. So they discussed it. After a while I left them and went on to the railway station to get many morning papers as I could. But I will not weary the reader with a description of that long morning and of the longer afternoon. I did not succeed in getting a glimpse of the common, or even Horsell or Chobham Church towers were in the hands of the military authorities. The soldiers I addressed didn't know anything. The officers were mysterious as well as busy. I found people in town quite secure again in the presence of the military, and heard for the first time from Marshall, the tobacconist, that his son was among the dead on the common. The soldiers had made the people on the outskirts of Horsell lock up and leave their houses. I got back to lunch about 2, very tired, for as I have said, the day was extremely hot and dull, and in order to refresh myself, I took a cold bath in the afternoon. About half an hour, I went up to the railway station to get an evening paper, for the morning papers had contained only very inaccurate description of the killing of Stent, Henderson, Ogilvy, and the others. But there was little I didn't know. The Martians did not show an inch of themselves. They seemed busy in their pit, and there was a sound of hammering and an almost continuous streamer of smoke. Apparently, they were busy getting ready for a struggle. Fresh attempts have been made to signal, but without success, was the stereotyped formula of the papers. A paper sapper told me it was done by a man in a ditch with a flag on a long pole. The Martians took as much notice of such advances as we should of the lowing of a cow. I must confess, the sight of all this armament, all of the preparation greatly excited me. My imagination became belligerent and defeated the invaders in a dozen striking ways. Something of my schoolboy dreams of battle and heroism came back. It hardly seemed a fair fight to me at the time. They seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs. About 3 o'clock, there began a thud of a gun at measured intervals from Chestersea or Alderstone. I learned that the smouldering pine wood into which the second cylinder had fallen was being shelled. In the hope of destroying that object before it opened, it was only about 5, however, that a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of Martians. About 6 in the evening, as I sat to tea with my wife in the summer house, talking vigorously about the battle that was lowering upon us, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately after a gust of firing, close on the heels of that came a violent rattling crash quite close to us. It shook the ground, and starting out upon the lawn, I saw the tops of the trees about the Oriental College burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church beside it slid down into ruin. The pinnacle of the mosque had vanished, and the roof line of the college itself looked as if 100-ton gun had been work upon it. One of our chimneys cracked as if a shot had hit it, flew, and a piece of it came clattering down on the tiles and made a heap of broken red fragments upon the flower bed by my study window. I and my wife stood amazed. Then I realized the crest of Maybury Hill must be within range of the Martian's heat ray, now that the college was cleared out of the way. At that, I gripped my wife's arm and without ceremony ran her into the road. Then I fetched out the servant, telling her I would go upstairs myself for a box she was clamoring for. We can't possibly stay here, I said, and as I spoke, the firing opened for a moment upon the common. But where are we to go? Said my wife in terror. I thought, perplexed. Then I remembered her cousins at Leatherhead. Leatherhead, I shouted above the sudden noise. She looked away from me downhill. The people were coming out of their houses, astonished. How are we to get to Leatherhead? She said. Down the hill I saw a bevy of hussars ride under the railway bridge. 3 galloped through the open gates of the Oriental College. 2 others dismounted and began running from house to house. The sun, shining through the smoke that drove up from the tops of the trees, seemed blood red, and threw an unfamiliar, lurid light upon everything. Stop here, said I. You are safe here. And I started off at once for the Spotted Dog, for I knew the landlord had a horse and a dog cart. I ran, for I perceived that in a moment every one upon the side of the hill would be moving. I found him in his bar, quite unaware of what was going on behind his house. A man stood with his back to me, talking to him. I must have £1, said the landlord, and I've no one to drive it. I'll give you 2, said I, over the stranger's shoulder. What for? And I'll bring it back by midnight, I said. Lord, said the landlord, what's the hurry? I'm selling my bit of pig, £2, and you bring it back. What's going on now? I explained hastily that I had to leave my home and so secured the dog cart. At the time, it did not seem to me nearly so urgent that the landlord should leave his. I took care to have the cart there and then drove it off down the road, and leaving it in charge of my wife and servant, rushed into my house and packed a few valuables, such plate as we had, and so forth. The beech trees below the house were burning while I did this, and the palings up on the road glowed red. While I was occupied in this way, one of the dismounted hussars came running up. He was going from house to house, warning people to leave. He was going on as I came out of my front door, lugging my treasures, done up in a tablecloth. I shouted after him, "What news?" He turned, stared, bawled something about crawling out in a thing like dish cover, and ran on to the gatehouse at the crest. A sudden whirl of black smoke driving across the road hid him for a moment. I ran to my neighbor's door and rapped to satisfy myself of what I already knew, that his wife had gone to London with him and locked up their house. I went in again, according to my promise, to get my servant's box, lugged it out, clapped it beside her on the tail of the dog cart, and then caught the reins and jumped up into the driver's seat beside my wife. In another moment, we were clear of the smoke and noise and the spanking down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill towards Old Woking. In front was a quiet, sunny landscape, a wheat field ahead on either side of the road, and the Maybury Inn with its swinging sign. I saw the doctor's cart ahead of me. At the bottom of the hill, I turned my head to look at the hillside as I was leaving. Thick streamers of black smoke shot with threads of red fire and were driving up into the still air and throwing dark shadows upon the green tree tops eastward. The smoke already extended far away to the east and west, to the Byfleet pine woods eastward, and to Woking on the west. The road was dotted with people running towards us, and very faint now, but very distinct through the hot, quiet air, one heard the whir of a machine gun that was presently stilled, and an intermittent cracking of rifles. Apparently, the Martians were setting fire to everything within range of their heat ray. I am not an expert driver, and I had immediately to turn my attention to the horse. When I looked back again, the second hill had hidden the black smoke. I slashed the horse with the whip and gave him a loose rein until Woking, and send lay between us and that quivering tumult. I overtook and passed the doctor between Woking and Send. Chapter 10. In the Storm. Leatherhead is about 12 miles from Maybury Hill. The scent of hay was in the air, through the lush meadows beyond Pryford, and the hedges on either side were sweet and gay with multitudes of dog roses. The heavy firing that had broken out while we were driving down Maybury Hill ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving the evening very peaceful and still. We got to Leatherhead without misadventure about 9 o'clock, and the horse had an hour's rest while I took supper with my cousins and commended my wife to their care. My wife was curiously silent throughout the drive and seemed oppressed with forebodings of evil. I talked to her reassuringly, pointing out that the Martians were tied to the pit by sheer heaviness, and at the utmost could but crawl a little out of it, but she answered only in monosyllables. Had it not been for my promise to the innkeeper, she would, I think, have urged me to stay in Leatherhead that night. Would that I had. Her face, I remember, was very white as we parted. For my own part, I had been feverishly excited all day. Something very like the war fever that occasionally runs through the civilized community had got into my blood, and in my heart I was not very sorry that I had to return to Maybury that night. I was even afraid that the last fusillade I had heard might mean the extermination of our invaders from Mars. I can best express my state of mind by saying that I wanted to be in at the death. It was nearly 11 when I started to return. The night was unexpected to me. Walking out of the lighted passage of my cousin's house, it seemed indeed black, and it was as hot and close as the day. Overhead, the clouds were driving fast, albeit not a breath stirred the shrubs about us. My cousin's man lit both lamps. Happily, I knew the road intimately. My wife stood in the light of the doorway and watched me until I jumped up into the dog cart. Then abruptly she turned and went in, leaving my cousin's side by wishing me a good hap. I was a little depressed at first, with contagion of my wife's fears, but very soon my thoughts reverted to the Martians. At that time, I was absolutely in the dark as to the course of the evening's fighting. I did not know even the circumstances that had precipitated the conflict. As I came through Ockham, for that was the way I returned, and not through Send and Old Woking, I saw along the western horizon a blood-red glow, which, as I drew nearer, crept slowly up the sky. The driving clouds of gathering thunderstorm mingled there with masses of black and red smoke. Ripley Street was deserted, and except for a lighted window or so in the village, showed not a sign of life. But I narrowly escaped an accident at the corner of the road to Pryford, where a knot of people stood with their backs to me. They said nothing to me as I passed. I do not know what they knew of things happening beyond the hill, nor do I know if the silent houses I passed on my way were sleeping securely, or deserted and empty, or harassed and watching against the terror of the night. From Ripley until I came through Pryford, I was in the village of Way, and the red glare was hidden from me. As I ascended the little hill beyond Pryford Church, the glare came into view again, and the trees about me shivered with the first intimation of the storm that was upon me. Then I heard midnight pealing out of Pryford Church behind me, and then came the silhouette of Maybury Hill, with its treetops and roof blacks and sharp against the red. Even as I beheld this, a lurid green glare lit the road about me, and showed the distant woods towards Addlestone. I felt a tug at the reins. I saw that the driving clouds had been pierced as it were by a thread of green fire. Suddenly, lighting their confusion, and falling into the field to my left, it was the third falling star. Close on its apparition, and blindingly violet by contrast, danced out the first lightning of the gathering storm, and the thunderbursts like a rocket overhead. The horse took a bit between his teeth and bolted. A moderate incline runs towards the foot of Maybury Hill, and down this we clattered. Once the lightning had begun, it went on in as rapid a succession of flashes as I have ever seen. The thunderclaps, treading one on the heels of another, and with strange crackling accompaniment, sounded more like the working of a giant electrical machine than the usual detonating of reverberations. The flickering light was blinding and confusing, and then a thin hail smote gustily at my face as I drove down the slope. At first, I regarded little but the road before me, and then abruptly my attention was arrested by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill. At first, I took it for the wet roof of a house, but one flash following another showed it to be swift rolling movement. It was an elusive vision, a moment of bewildering darkness, and then, in a flash like daylight, the red masses of the orphanage near the crest of the hill, the green tops of the pine trees, and this problematical object came out clear and sharp and bright. And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod, higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them aside in its career. A walking engine of glittering metal, striding now across the heather, articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. A flash, and it came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air to vanish and reappear almost instantly, as it seemed. With the next flash, 100 yards nearer, can you imagine a milking stool tilted and bowled violently along the ground? That was the impression those instant flashes gave. But instead of a milking stool, imagine that great body of machinery on a tripod stand. Then suddenly, the trees in the pine wood ahead of me were parted as brittle reeds were parted by a man thrusting through them. They were snapped off and driven headlong, and a second huge tripod appeared, rushing, as it seemed, headlong towards me. And I was galloping hard to meet it. At the sight of the second monster, my nerve went altogether, not stopping to look again. I wrenched the horse's head hard round to the right, and in another moment the dog-cart had heeled over upon the horse. The shaft smashed noisily, and I was flung sideways and fell heavily into a shallow pool of water. I crawled out almost immediately and crouched, my feet still in the water under a clump of firs. The horse lay motionless. His neck was broken, poor brute. And the lightning flashes, I saw the black bulk of the overturned dog-cart and the silhouette of the wheel still spinning slowly. In another moment, the colossal mechanism went striding by me and passed uphill towards Pireford. Seen nearer, the thing was incredibly strange, for it was no mere insensate machine driving on its way. Machine it was, with a ringing young pine tree swinging and rattling about its strange body. It picked its road, and it was striding along, and the brazen hood that surmounted it moved to and fro. The inevitable suggestion of a head looking about behind the main body was a huge mass of metal, of white metal, like gigantic fisherman's basket, and the puffs of green smoke squirted out from the joints. The limbs of the monster swept by me, and in an instant it was gone. So much I saw then, all vaguely for the flickering of the lightning in blinding highlights and the dense black shadows. As it passed, it set up an excellent, deafening howl that drowned the thunder. Ow! Ow! And then in another minute, it was with a companion half a mile away, stooping over something in the field. I have no doubt this thing in the field was the third of 10 cylinders they had fired at us from Mars. For some minutes I lay there in the rain and darkness, watching, by the intermittent light, these monstrous beings of metal moving about in the distance over the hedge tops. A thin hail was now beginning, and as it came and went, their figures grew misty and then flashed into clearness again. Now and then came a gap in the lightning, and the night swallowed them up. I was soaked with hail above the puddle water below. It was some time before my blank astonishment would let me struggle up the bank to driver position or think at all of my imminent peril. Not far from me was a little one-roomed squatter's hut of wood surrounded by a patch of potato garden. I struggled to my feet at last, and crouching and making use of every chance to cover, I made a run for this. I hammered the door, but I could not make the people hear, if there were any people inside. And after time, I desisted, and availing myself of a ditch for greater part of the way, succeeding in crawling unobserved by these monstrous machines into the pine wood towards Maybury. Under cover of this, I pushed on, wet and shivering now, towards my own house. I walked among the trees, trying to find the footpath. It was very dark, indeed, in the wood, for the lightning was now becoming infrequent, and the hail, which was pouring down in a torrent, fell in columns through the gaps in the heavy foliage. If I had fully realized the meaning of all things I had seen, I should have immediately worked my way round through Byfleet to Street Cobham, and so gone back to rejoin my wife at Leatherhead. But that night, the strangeness of things about me and my physical wretchedness prevented me, for I was bruised, weary, wet to the skin, deafened and blinded by the storm. I had a vague idea of going on to my own house, and that was as much motive as I had. I staggered through the trees, fell into a ditch and bruised my knees against a plank, and finally splashed out into a lane that ran down from College Arms. I say splashed, for the storm water was sweeping the sand down the hill in a muddy torrent. There, in the darkness, a man blundered into me and sent me reeling back. He gave a cry of terror, sprang sideways, and rushed on before I could gather my wits sufficiently to speak to him. So heavy was the stress of this storm just at this place that I had the hardest task to win my way up the hill. I went close up the fence on the left and worked my way along its palings. Near the top, I stumbled upon something soft, and, by a flash of lightning, saw between my feet a heap of black broadcloth and a pair of boots. Before I could distinguish clearly how the man lay, the flicker of light had passed. I stood over him for the next flash. When it came, I saw that he was a sturdy man, cheaply but not shabbily dressed. His head was bent under his body, and he lay crumpled up close to the fence as though he had been flung violently against it. Overcoming the repugnance natural to one who had never before touched a dead body, I stooped and turned him over to feel for his heart. He was quite dead. Apparently, his neck had been broken. The lightning flashed for a third time, and his face leaped upon me. I sprang to my feet. It was the landlord of the Spotted Dog, whose conveyance I had taken. I stepped over him gingerly and pushed on up the hill. I made my way to the police station and the College Arms towards my own house. Nothing was burning on the hillside. though from the common there still came a red glare and a rolling tumult of ruddy smoke beating up against the drenching hail. So far as I could see, the houses about me were mostly uninjured. By the college arms, a dark heap lay in the road. Down the road, towards Maybury Bridge, there were voices and the sound of feet. But I had not the courage to shout or to go to them. I let myself in with my latchkey, closed, locked, and bolted the door, staggered to the front of the staircase, and sat down. My imagination was full of those striding metallic monsters and of the dead bodies smashed against the fence. I crouched at the foot of the staircase with my back to the wall, shivering violently. Chapter 11. At the Window. I have already said that my storms of emotion have a trick of exhausting themselves. After a time, I discovered that I was cold and wet, and with little pools of water about me on the stair carpet. I got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room, and drank some whiskey, and then I was moved to change my clothes. After I had done that, I went upstairs to my study, but why I did so I do not know. The window of my study looks over the trees and the railways towards Horsell Common. In the hurry of our departure, this window had been left open. The passage was dark, and by contrast with the picture the window frame enclosed, the side of the room seemed impenetrably dark. I stopped short in a doorway. The thunderstorm had passed. The towers of the Oriental College and the pine trees about it had gone, and very far away, little by a vivid red glare, the common about the sandpits was visible. Across the light, huge black shapes, grotesque and strange, moved bustily to and fro. It seemed indeed as the whole country in that direction was on fire. A broad hill set with minute tongues of flame, swaying and writhing with the guts of the dying storm, and throwing a red reflection upon the cloud scud above. Every now and then, a haze of smoke from some nearer conflagration drove across the window and hid the Martian shapes. I could not see what they were doing, nor the clear form of them, nor recognize the black objects that were busied upon. Neither could I see the nearer fire, though the reflections of it danced on the wall and ceiling of the study. A sharp, resinous tang of burning was in the air. I closed the door noiselessly and crept towards the window. As I did so, the view opened out until the one hand it reached to the houses about Woking Station, and on the other to the charred and blackened pine woods of Byfleet. There was a light down the hill, on the railway, near the arch, and several of the houses along the Maybury Road and the streets near the station were glowing ruins. The light upon the railway puzzled me at first. There were a black heap and a vivid glare, and to the right of that a row of yellow oblongs. Then I perceived this was a wrecked train. The forepart smashed and on fire, the hinder carriages still upon the rails. Between these, three main centres of light, the houses, the train, and the burning country towards Chobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing and smoking ground. It was the strangest spectacle, that black expanse set with fire. It reminded me, more than anything else, of the potteries at night. At first I could distinguish no people at all, though I peered intently for them. Later I saw against the light of Woking Station a number of black figures hurrying one after the another across the line. And this was the little world in which I had been living securely for years, this fiery chaos. What had happened in the last 7 hours I still did not know, nor did I know, though I was beginning to guess, the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I had seen disgorged from the cylinder. With a queer feeling of impersonal interest, I turned my desk chair to the window, sat down, and stared at the blackened country, and particularly at the three gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare about the sandpits. They seemed amazingly busy. I began to ask myself what they could be. Were they intelligent mechanisms? Such a thing I felt was impossible. Or did a Martian sit within each, ruling, directing, using, much as a man's brain sits and rules his own body? I began to compare the things to human machines, to ask myself, for the first time in my life, how an ironclad or steam engine would seem to an intelligent lower animal. The storm had left the sky clear, and over the smoke of the burning land, the little fading pin point of Mars was dropping into the west. When a soldier came into my garden, I heard a slight scraping at the fence, and rousing myself from the lethargy that had fallen upon me, I looked down and saw him dimly, clambering over the palings. At the sight of another human being, my torpor passed, and I leaned out the window eagerly. "St!" said I in a whisper. He stopped astride the fence in doubt. Then he came over and across the lawn to the corner of the house. He bent down, stepped softly. "Who's there?" he said, also whispering, standing under the window and peering up. "Where are you going?" I asked. "God knows." "Are you trying to hide?" "Yeah, that's it." "Come into the house," I said. I went down, unfastened the door, and let him in, and locked the door again. I could not see his face. He was hatless, and his coat was unbuttoned. "My God," he said, as I drew him in. "What happened?" I asked. "What hasn't?" In the obscurity, I could see he made a gesture of despair. "They wiped us out, simply wiped us out," he repeated again and again. He followed me, almost mechanically, into the dining room. "Take some whiskey," I said, pouring out a stiff dose. He drank it. Then abruptly he sat down before the table, put his head on his arms, and began to sob and weep like a little boy, in a perfect passion of emotion, while I, with a curious forgetfulness of my own recent despair, stood beside him, wondering. It was a long time before he could steady his nerves to answer my questions, and then he answered perplexingly and brokenly. He was a driver in the artillery, and had only come into action about 7. At that time, firing was going on across the common, and it was said that the first party of Martians were crawling slowly towards their second cylinder under cover of metal shield. Later, this shield staggered up on tripod legs and became the first of the fighting machines. The gun he drove had been unlimbered near Horsell in order to command the sandpits, and its arrival it had precipitated the action. The limber gunners went to the rear. His horse trod in a rabbit hole and came down, throwing him into the depression of the ground. At the same moment, the gun exploded behind him. The ammunition blew up. There was fire all about him, and he found himself lying under a heap of charred dead men and dead horses. I lay still," he said, "scared out of my wits, with the forequarter of a horse atop me. We'd been wiped out, and the smell, good God, like burnt meat. I was hurt across the back by the fall of the horse, and there I had to lie until I felt better. Just like a parade it had been in a minute before, then stumble, bang, swish, wiped out," he said. He had hid under the dead horse for a long time, peering out furtively across the common. The Cardigan men had tried to rush in, skirmishing order at the pit simply to be swept out of existence. Then the monster had risen to its feet and begun to walk leisurely to and fro across the common, among the few fugitives with its head-like hood, turning about exactly like the head of a cowled human being. A kind of arm carried a complicated metallic case about which green flashes scintillated, and out of the funnel of this there smote the heat ray. In a few minutes, there was, so far as the soldier could see, not a living thing left upon the common, and every bush and tree upon it that was not already a blackened skeleton was burning. The hussars had been on the road beyond the curvature of the ground, and he saw nothing of them. He heard the Maxims rattle for a time and then become still. The giant saved Woking Station and its cluster of houses until the last. Then, in a moment, the heat ray was brought to bear, and the town became a heap of fiery ruins. Then the thing shut off the heat ray, and, turning its back upon the artilleryman, began to waddle away towards the smouldering pine woods that sheltered the second cylinder. And it did so a second glittering titan built itself up out of the pit. The second monster followed the first, and at that the artilleryman began to crawl very cautiously across the hot heather ash towards Horsell. He managed to get alive into the ditch by the side of the road, and so escaped to Woking. There his story became ejaculatory. The place was impossible, it seems. There were few people alive there, frantic for the most part, and many burned and scalded. He was turned aside by the fire and hid among some almost scorching heaps of broken wall as one of the Martian giants returned. He saw this one pursue a man, catch him up in the most steely tentacles, and knock his head against the trunk of a pine tree. At last, after nightfall, the artilleryman made a rush for it and got over the railway embankment. Since then, he had been sulking along towards Maybury in the hope of getting out of danger, Londonward. People were hiding in trenches, in cellars, and many of the survivors had made off towards Woking village and Send. He had been consumed with thirst until he found one of the water mains near the railway arch smashed, and the water bubbling out like a spring upon the road. That was the story I got from him, bit by bit. He grew calmer, telling me, and trying to make me see things that he had seen. He had eaten no food since midday. He told me early in his narrative, and I found some mutton and bread in the pantry and brought it into the room. We lit no lamp for fear of attracting the Martians, and ever the again... We're almost finished. Attracting the Martians, and ever again our hands would touch upon bread or meat. As he talked, things about us came darkly out of the darkness, and the trampled bushes and the broken rose trees outside the window grew distinct. It would seem that a number of men or animals had rushed across the lawn. I began to see his face blackened and haggard, as no doubt mine was also. When we had finished eating, we went softly upstairs to my study, and I looked again out my open window. In one night, the valley had become the valley of ashes. The fires had dwindled now. Where flames had been, there were now streamers of smoke. But the countless ruins of shattered and gutted houses and blasted and blackened trees that the night had hidden stood out now, gaunt and terrible, in the pitiless light of dawn. Yet, here and there, some objects had the luck to escape. A white railway signal here, the end of a greenhouse there, white and fresh amid the wreckage. Never before in history or warfare had destruction been so indiscriminate and so universal. And shining with the growing light of the east, 3 of the metallic giants stood about the pit, their cowls rotating as they were surveying the desolation they had made. It seemed to me that the pit had been enlarged, and ever and again puffs of vivid green vapor streamed up out of it toward the brightening dawn, streamed up, whirled, broke, and vanished. Beyond were the pillars of fire about Trebum. They became pillars of bloodshot smoke at the first touch of the day. That is where we end off. We're at chapter 12. If you join me next week, I will have more story time for you. Let's just see how many chapters there are. I'll look and see what we've got here. Oh, good. Lovely conversation going on. Oh, good. Okay. So we're about halfway through the War of the Worlds, but then it goes on to book 2, The Earth Under the Martians. I do hope that you are enjoying this. I definitely enjoy reading to you. A great way of supporting the channel, if you can, if it brings you value, and only if it is not causing trouble, is you can go to my Patreon, and that is patreon.com/the Gentleman Psychic. You can also find me on PayPal under my email address. I really enjoy this story. I've never read it fully myself, so it's going to be fun. There are some really lovely stories in this book. We might be able to finish the whole thing because we go on to, of course, the War of the Worlds, the world under the Martians, etc. And then we've got the Invisible Man and the Time Machine. So other great. I may read the Time Machine next. After this, I really appreciate each and every one of you. Again, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for all of the likes, the comments, the shares. That does help me out tremendously. Let's see. I just want to see what we've got here. Christy is feeling better, which is good. Nekapika says, hello, good sir. Hello, good evening. Scotty Dahati, who remembers when he was on Ghost Adventures? I remember when I was on Ghost Adventures. That was a good episode. Yes, the house is actively haunted, though I have now moved to New York. And let's see. I'm listening. Lovely to have you. Excellent, Howl. Thank you. I've grown quite fond of your narrations, Mr. Lillard. I appreciate that. All right, my loves. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. Tune in next week. I don't think that we'll do a Scared and Alone tomorrow because of inclement weather, but it is possible that I might come on and do something special. I won't read from that. Well, I might. I'll keep you posted, but we won't have Scared and Alone tomorrow, more than likely. So with that, my lovelies, I bid you good night. I bid you good morning whenever you're watching this, and I shall see you next time. Good night.